The underground slave pits tasted like rusted iron and stale urine. Ronan stood at the edge of the shattered gates, his ribs expanding against his armor. Blood Moon belonged to him now. Tearing down their walls and breaking their alpha should have felt like a victory, yet standing in the suffocating dark left an ash-like rot on his tongue. A warlord afforded no weakness. Grinding his back teeth together, he marched down the uneven stone steps, his combat boots crushing loose gravel into dust. Terror radiated from the cages below. Men and women huddled in the freezing mud, stinking of infection and surrender. Custom demanded he choose one to take as a political bride. It served as a final, brutal humiliation to cement his rule over the surviving elders. He scanned the filthy faces, finding nothing but hollow eyes, until a sharp crack whipped through the cavern. Ronan whipped his head toward the echo. An overseer, one of the lingering guard dogs too stupid to flee, raised a sparking stun baton over a trembling boy. The guard swung. Metal hissed through the damp air. A blur of gray rags threw itself over the child just as the electrified baton connected. Flesh sizzled. The brutal impact forced a hard, ugly grunt from her throat. But she didn't crumble into the dirt. Wrapping thin, bruised arms around the boy, she absorbed the voltage, burying her face in the child's shoulder. No crying, no begging. Drawn by some invisible tether, Ronan descended the final steps. Golden eyes tracked the blood, weeping through her ruined shirt. Matted dark hair clung to her sweat-slicked forehead, yet she knelt in the filth with the unbending spine of a queen. The overseer raised the baton for a second strike. A low rumble vibrated against Ronan's sternum. Stop! The word dropped like a boulder in a quiet pond. Metal clattered against rock as the baton slipped from the overseer's sweating grip. Dust motes drifted through the slashes of moonlight, cutting the gloom. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Ignoring the black mud coating his polished greaves, Ronan closed the distance. He stopped inches from her kneeling form. Up close, her scent hit him a physical strike to the chest. Ozone. Rainwater snapping over hot stone. Lightning ripping the night sky apart. His inner beast thrashed, tearing at the confines of his mind with frantic claws. Digging his fingernails into his palms, he forced a slow, measured drag of oxygen into his burning lungs. She lifted her chin. Mud smeared her cheekbone, but her eyes locked onto his with blistering, white-hot hatred. The tension shattered. Confronting a broken captive who looked ready to tear his throat open with her bare teeth was dangerous enough, but the sudden, violent stutter of his pulse felt far worse. "You," Ronan rasped. "You are coming with me." She refused to blink, holding his stare like a loaded gun. He had found his prize. But staring into that calculating darkness, he realized he had just invited a predator into his home. Hauling her up from the suffocating rot of the pits to the frozen courtyard took less than 10 minutes, but the brutal shift in temperature stung his skin. The mountain wind whipped his dark cloak around his boots as the entire pack formed a silent, watching ring around the central stone platform. Claiming the territory meant claiming her flesh. 2 scarred mercenaries dragged the girl forward, though she walked on her own feet, her posture rigid and defiant. Someone had dragged a wet rag across her face, exposing sharp cheekbones framing a bruised jaw. The head priest approached holding the branding iron. Radiant, angry orange heat warped the air above the metal rod. A cold knot twisted in Ronan's gut. He curled his hands into fists inside his leather gloves, burying the sudden, violent urge to rip the iron from the priest's grip and snap his neck. Showing mercy here meant looking soft. Soft warlords died, taking thousands of loyal soldiers with them. He forced himself to watch. The priest shoved her shoulders down. Kneeling on the cracked stone, she fixed her dead, unyielding stare entirely on Ronan. The priest drove the searing iron directly into the tender flesh of her neck. Searing heat hissed against skin. Plumes of gray smoke curled into the winter wind. Ronan braced for the inevitable scream, waiting for the crack in her armor. He waited. He listened to the pop of burning tissue. Absolute silence. her teeth ground together with enough force to risk shattering enamel. Her fingers twisted into the frayed hem of her dress, turning her knuckles bone white, but she swallowed the agony. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, a flare of blinding, pure white energy erupted deep within her pupils. It vanished instantly, a terrifying, ancient current that forced his inner wolf to cower, whining in reverence. The priest yanked the metal away. She swayed, her skin drained of color, but she refused to collapse. The jagged crown of his pack now marked her throat forever. Copper blood and sharp ozone tangled in the freezing air, dragging a feral growl up Ronan's throat. Pushing herself up from the stone, she pressed two dirty fingers against the blistered burn, then leveled a look at Ronan that promised absolute ruin. Stepping forward, he let his voice carry over the wind. "Bring the transport. We leave for the citadel." He turned his back on the courtyard, his pulse hammering a warning against his ribs. He came to conquer a dying pack, but he was leaving with a storm that would drown them all. The armored transport rumbled over the jagged mountain pass, vibrating the floorboards for miles as they left the ruined stronghold behind. Inside the cramped, dim cabin, the quiet felt thick enough to choke on. Ronan occupied the bench on one side, his broad shoulders crowding the reinforced walls. Across the narrow aisle, his new bride folded herself into the corner of the leather seat, pulling her knees tight against her chest. She looked fragile enough to shatter, yet her eyes tracked his every flinch like a cornered viper. Stale cabin air circulated the smell of her slow weeping burn. The copper scent scraped at Ronan's chest, agitating the beast prowling through his skull. It demanded he fix the wound. It demanded he protect what he just ruined. Refusing to endure the silent accusation any longer, he popped the latch on a side compartment. He withdrew a sterile white cloth and a glass vial of antiseptic. Leaning forward an inch at a time, he kept his movements deliberate. "Your neck," Ronan rasped. "It needs cleaning. Infection will set in." She tracked the cloth in his scarred hand, then dragged her gaze up to his face. A harsh, scraped laugh clawed its way out of her throat. "You burn me," she whispered, the sound like crushed glass. "Then you offer a bandage. Is that how the great warlord sleeps?" The insult landed like a boot to the stomach. Engine noise hummed beneath their feet. The tires crushed rocks outside the tinted glass. He deserved the hatred, having bought her survival with violence. He kept his hand steady, bridging the space between them. Securing the territory required the mark. Without it, my generals would have slaughtered everyone left in those cages, including the boy. Her breath hitched. Raw panic fractured her cold mask for a fraction of a second before defensive rage slammed back into place. He had found the brother, but weaponizing the boy's life tasted like bile. "Take the cloth," he ordered, lowering his voice to a quiet truce. Slowly, deliberately, she turned her head toward the reinforced window, staring out at the passing black trees. Total rejection. The fresh brand on her skin throbbed, and a phantom burn echoed along his own collarbone. Setting the supplies on the leather cushion beside her, he retreated into the shadows of the cabin. He had intended to lock a prisoner inside his mountain fortress, but watching her cold, calculating reflection in the glass, he knew he was the one trapped in the cage. The transport tires squealed against the polished concrete of the subterranean garage, bringing the silent drive to a jarring halt. Steel bay doors grated shut behind them, sealing off the freezing mountain wind and locking them inside the brightly lit compound. Beside him on the leather bench, the girl pressed her spine into the corner. Her pulse thumped a frantic rhythm against her collarbone. Her eyes tracked the shadows, searching for rusted chains and stone dungeon walls. Shoving his door open, Ronan stepped onto the concrete and bypassed the armed sentries. The soldiers stared at the bloodied captive, trailing him with naked disgust. A low, vibrating tremor rattled his ribcage. He snapped a single, dead-eyed look at the closest guard, forcing the man's gaze to the floor instantly. He required no words. The threat of violence rolled off his shoulders in waves. They stepped into the sleek glass elevator. The doors sealed shut. Machinery whirred, launching them upward through the towering structure, leaving the subterranean levels far below. City lights blurred into gold and crimson streaks through the glass, reflecting in the girl's eyes as her sharp mind calculated the perimeter of the sprawling territory. A soft chime signaled the highest floor. Hardwood replaced concrete. A roaring fire cracked inside a stone hearth, casting shadows over oversized leather couches and a sprawling bed. No iron bars, no chains. She stopped walking, her boots scuffed against the plush rug. The quiet hum of the climate control filled the silence as her gaze darted from the crystal decanters on the counter to the locked exit. Folding her bruised arms over her ribs, she turned to face him. She braced her shoulders, waiting for the first strike. Ronan stayed planted by the elevator. He tracked the ugly, weeping burn, marring her throat. With every measured breath he dragged into his lungs, the sterile air of his sanctuary tasted more and more like the violent storm she carried with her. The steel lock clicked into place, echoing off the high ceiling, and sealing the two of them alone inside the penthouse. Ronan crossed the hardwood, carrying a sterile silver tray loaded with gauze and antiseptic. The sharp tang of copper blood and panicked sweat overpowered the expensive cologne lingering in the room. "Sit," he ordered. The single syllable dropped into the space like a stone. She retreated instead. Her hips collided with the edge of a mahogany table. Snatching a brass candlestick from the polished wood, she raised it like a club, her knuckles strained white against the metal. He refused to reach for the pistol strapped to his thigh. This ruin belonged to him. Fixing it fell on his shoulders. Closing the distance in 2 long strides, he moved faster than human eyesight could track. He clamped his calloused fingers around her wrist before she could swing. She let out a sharp hiss, yanking backward to snap his grip. Ronan merely shifted his weight. Using his free hand, he pried the brass weapon from her fingers and let it drop. The metal clanged against the floorboards, leaving a high-pitched, ringing echo in its wake. She shoved her free palm against his chest armor, fighting with the frantic, clawing desperation of a trapped wildcat. Stepping into her space, he trapped her against the edge of the table. His thighs bracketed hers. The ambient heat radiating from his skin enveloped her in a stifling cocoon. Her struggles ceased. Her chest heaved against his rigid sternum, dragging jagged breaths into her lungs. "Breathe," he rasped, bowing his head until his lips brushed the air near her ear. He lifted a cold, wet cloth from the tray and pressed it against the blistering brand. She flinched, digging her fingernails into his dark shirt. The scent of rain and lightning flooded his senses, pulling him under like a riptide. As his thumb brushed the grime from her jawline, the terrifying truth settled into his bones. He didn't just want to bandage her wounds, he wanted to keep her here, even if her presence burned his entire empire to ash. Hours later, the crackling fire of the penthouse was replaced by the deafening chaos of the lower banquet hall. Silverware clattered against stone plates, accompanied by the boisterous, drunken shouts of his ruling generals. Ronan claimed the head of the obsidian table, watching his officers tear into charred meat and swallow dark ale to celebrate their slaughter of the Blood Moon forces. To his right, the girl sat completely motionless. Scrubbed clean of the mud, she wore a high-collared silk dress, yet the raw, red edges of her brand peeked above the fabric. A conquered trophy put on display. General Vane slammed his empty tankard against the stone. Grease shined in his coarse beard as he pointed a scarred finger at the girl. "A fine victory, Alpha," Vane boomed. Cruel laughter bounced off the vaulted ceiling. "And a fine little stray you dragged from the dirt. Does the mutt speak? Or just scrub floors?" Cold fury coated Ronan's tongue like frost. He braced his palms against the table to rise and snap Vane's neck. But the girl moved first. Picking up her silver goblet with steady fingers, she took a slow, deliberate sip of wine. She set the glass down. The crystal clinked against the stone. The sharp sound cut through the drunken laughter, silencing the room entirely. "I speak perfectly fine, General," she said. Her voice rang out smooth, flat, and completely devoid of fear. "But I reserve my words for soldiers who understand basic battlefield tactics." Complete silence fell over the hall. Vane's face flushed a violent purple. The girl offered a razor-sharp smile that sent a sudden spike of adrenaline straight into Ronan's bloodstream. "Your western flank push was sloppy," she continued, locking her dark eyes onto the general. "You left your supply lines completely exposed in the valley. If our Alpha hadn't been a coward, he would have severed your rearguard and slaughtered your entire regiment. You won on dumb luck." Chaos exploded. Chairs screeched backward against the stone floor. Men roared in outrage. Vane vaulted over the table, his canines lengthening into jagged fangs. Ronan drove his fist into the obsidian surface. The rock fractured with a deafening crack. "Sit down, Vane," he ordered. The lethal, vibrating command slammed into the general's chest, forcing the man back into his seat instantly. Ronan turned his head, studying the girl. She hadn't flinched. She possessed the calculating mind of a battlefield commander and the reckless courage of a martyr. A dark smirk pulled at the corner of his mouth. She had just declared war on his most dangerous killers, and he realized he couldn't wait to watch her tear them apart. Midnight stripped the citadel of its chaotic noise, leaving the sprawling archives drowned in cold moonlight. Ronan stood perfectly still inside the arched doorway, letting the shadows swallow his towering frame. He tracked the girl. She stood before a glowing data terminal, her pale fingers flying across the glass keyboard. A metallic spike of dread coated the back of his tongue. She had cracked his encrypted logs. Blue light washed over her sharp cheekbones as she scrolled through the war records, detailing his violent ascent to the throne. He refused to move. He watched her uncover the slaughter of his father and brothers. He watched her read how he butchered his own bloodline to stop their torture of the lower castes. The truth branded him a kinslayer, a monster. The frantic tapping stopped. Instead of the bitter scent of terror flooding the room, a strange, suffocating calm settled over the archives. The smell of old vellum mixed with an overwhelming wave of profound sorrow. She dropped her hand from the glass. Her shoulders slumped, shedding their defensive armor. Ronan stepped onto the hardwood. His combat boots snapped a dry floorboard, echoing like a gunshot in the absolute quiet. She whipped around, dark hair flying across her collarbone. He crossed the room, stopping just out of arm's reach. He forced himself to hold her gaze. "Now you know," Ronan rasped, the words scraping his throat raw. "You see the exact beast keeping you in a cage." She refused to back away. Her eyes dropped to his scarred knuckles, then tracked back up to his face. "You killed them to save the slaves," she whispered. The oxygen returned to his burning lungs in a violent rush. She saw the battered soldier beneath the warlord exterior, igniting a dangerous spark of hope in the dead center of his chest. Then, the perimeter alarms shrieked. Blood-red strobe lights fractured the shadows, painting the library in a violent wash of crimson. The fragile peace shattered into pieces. The enemy had finally breached his gates. The piercing wail of the sirens drove a spike of sheer agony through Ronan's enhanced eardrums. "Move!" he barked, catching her wrist and hauling her violently away from the exposed glass windows. Reinforced blast doors slammed shut behind them as they sprinted down the spiraling stone corridor. Blood Moon loyalists had somehow shattered the outer wards. Dragging her past shouting guards, he forced her into a steel bunker built directly into the mountain rock. He shoved her inside and stepped in behind her. The deadbolt engaged with a final, echoing crack. Absolute blackness swallowed them. The closet-sized space forced them entirely too close together. Ronan braced his palms against the freezing steel door, trapping her between his rigid arms. He listened to her jagged, frantic breaths bouncing off the metal walls. The metallic tang of pure adrenaline spiked the stale air. He waited for the ringing in his ears to fade, forcing the blind panic to settle into a cold, lethal focus. "Are they coming for me?" she asked, her voice trembling just enough to betray her fear. "They have to climb a mountain of my dead before they reach this door," Ronan promised, his tone completely flat. "Then they face me." In the suffocating dark, her fingers brushed the center of his chest. She sought physical balance, but found the erratic, hammering rhythm of his pulse instead. Her palm flattened against his tactical shirt. The feather-light contact ripped a low, vibrating tremor from his sternum. It was a completely involuntary reflex of violent protection. She didn't pull away. She stepped a fraction of an inch closer, tilting her face upward in the pitch black. The scent of rainwater and ozone warped his senses. He leaned down, driven by an overwhelming urge to crush his mouth against hers and claim her in the absolute dark. A concussive blast rocked the floorboards beneath their boots. Plastered dust rained onto his shoulders. The siege had breached the inner keep. He needed to leave the bunker, slaughter the invaders, and extract the traitor who sold out his security codes. Sunlight bled through the high windows of the training wing, baking the smell of sweat and polished leather into the humid air. The siege had broken by dawn, leaving the citadel standing, but violent adrenaline still spiked the girl's blood. She refused the safety of the tower, demanding to learn how to kill. Ronan paced the center of the foam mat, wearing only loose combat trousers. Perspiration slicked his bare chest as he tracked her movements. Clad in black tactical gear, she circled him like a cornered predator testing the fence. She lunged, a sharp, desperate strike aimed directly at his jaw. Catching her wrist midair, Ronan twisted his hips and swept his calf against the back of her knees. She slammed into the mat. The brutal thud echoed off the vaulted ceiling. He stood back, letting the dust motes swirl in the shafts of sunlight. He gave her exactly enough time to swallow the metallic taste of a split lip before she scrambled back to her feet. Again, she snapped. They crashed back together in a bruising, exhausting sequence. She slipped past his guard. He blocked a sweeping kick. Limbs tangled. Boots squeaked against the foam. Refusing to go easy on her, he pushed her physical limits until her lungs burned. Throwing a wild punch, she overextended her reach. He ducked, wrapping an arm around her waist. He spun her backward and drove her to the floor. Pinning her struggling form beneath his crushing weight, he clamped both of his hands around her wrists and pressed them flat above her head. "You strike blind," he grunted, fighting for oxygen. "Anger makes you predictable." A horrific, unnatural vibration rattled out of her chest. It possessed the pitch of an ancient earthquake, vibrating straight through the floorboards and into Ronan's bones. He stared down into her face. Her dark brown irises were gone. Blinding, pure white energy erupted from her pupils. The ambient temperature of the gym plummeted instantly. White frost crept across the edge of the foam mat, freezing the sweat on his skin. His inner beast hit the dirt, whining in absolute submission to a power older than the earth itself. Just as quickly, the white light fractured and vanished. Her brown eyes returned, wide and completely terrified by her own lack of control. She possessed a world-ending secret. The lethal display finally explained the walls she built around herself. Ronan refused to release her wrists. He held her pinned to the frozen mat, staring into her terrified eyes while the terrible reality clicked into place. The invaders from last night hadn't come to conquer his territory. They came to steal her. Sterile blue light from the surveillance monitors washed over the concrete walls of the subterranean security hub. Server towers hummed a relentless, vibrating drone in the background. Ronan braced his knuckles against the steel console, staring at the frozen footage from the training mat. He zoomed in on her pixelated face. Even distorted by the grainy lens, the blinding white energy erupting from her eyes burned into the screen. The zealots weren't trying to conquer a territory. They were hunting a god. Rubber soles squeaked against the floorboards behind him. A young tech officer stepped into the glow of the monitors, reeking of stale coffee and panicked sweat. The boy extended a cracked datapad with trembling fingers. "Alpha," the tech rasped. "We tracked the signal from the security breach. Someone inside the Citadel broadcasted our defense grid blind spots right before the siege." Ronan snatched the plastic device. His thumbnail tapped the cracked glass, pulling up the encrypted coordinates. The hum of the servers seemed to flatline. All the oxygen vanished from the room, leaving his lungs burning. The transmission didn't originate from the outer barracks. It didn't bounce from the servant quarters. The signal pinged directly from the highest tower, her private penthouse. A phantom blade slid straight under his ribs. When he was a boy starving in the winter storms, he had dragged a half-frozen stray into his tent. He fed it his last scrap of meat, The second the beast found its strength, it ripped his forearm open to the bone and fled. The violent sting of betrayal tasted exactly the same. Treason demanded an immediate, brutal execution. Yet, as he stared at the glowing numbers, his inner beast balked, refusing the logic. He knew the furious, honorable cadence of her pulse. She fought with too much raw pride to orchestrate a cowardly ambush in the dark. Someone else was pulling her strings. Scrolling deeper into the encrypted logs, the truth crystallized. The signal was a two-way transmission. Someone outside the walls was talking to her, leveraging the only person she loved enough to risk a firing squad for, her brother. If her brother belonged to the Zealots, the enemy already possessed a direct line past the outer wards. Plastic groaned, then snapped. Ronan crushed the datapad inside his fist. Shards of glass bit into his leather gloves. Lithium sparked against the concrete. He needed to flush the rats out of the shadows. To do that, he had to drag her out of the fortress and parade her right in front of the crosshairs. Afternoon sun baked the cobblestones of the lower city square, amplifying the stench of roasted mutton, diesel exhaust, and packed, nervous bodies. Refusing to let the populace think their warlord was cowering in a bunker after a siege, Ronan navigated the outdoor market in full tactical plating. He kept her tethered directly to his side. She wore a dark crimson cloak, the thick wool hood pulled up to hide the jagged brand on her throat. As they moved through the shouting merchants, her eyes tracked the rooftops, calculating every shadow and blind alley. A sudden, violent chill spiked the base of Ronan's skull. His instincts screamed a split-second warning. Sunlight caught a metallic glint on a rusted iron balcony 3 stories above the crowd. "Down!" Ronan barked. He reached to shove her behind his armored shoulder, but her suppressed lichen reflexes ignited. She launched her entire body weight against his chestplate. Striking him like a battering ram, she drove them both backward onto the unforgiving stone just as a concussive crack split the sky. A high-caliber round tore through the empty space where his skull had been a fraction of a second prior. They crashed onto the street. Dust and loose gravel exploded around them. The crowd shrieked, scattering into chaotic, terrified stampedes. Silence swallowed the ringing in Ronan's ears. He tasted dirt and rusted copper. Pushing up onto his knees, he waited for the smoke to clear. He scanned her form for the sniper's secondary target, ready to drag her to cover. She lay completely still against the cobblestones. A dark, wet stain bloomed across the ribs of her crimson cloak, soaking the wool with terrifying speed. The foundation of his entire world sheared off its axis. Warlord composure shattered into violent, thoughtless panic. "No," he choked, dragging his ruined knees across the gravel. "No." He hauled her up against his chest armor. Her skin possessed the temperature of cracked ice. She dragged a jagged, wet breath into her lungs, tangling her pale fingers into the straps of his vest. Pure, blinding terror flooded his veins, burning hotter than acid. The crown didn't matter. The territory was ash. The only thing tethering his sanity to the earth was the erratic, failing thump of her pulse. He didn't search the rooftops for the shooter. He didn't issue commands to his screaming guards. Scooping her bleeding frame into his arms, he launched himself toward the citadel gates. He ran through the panicked streets, leaving a trail of dark blood on the stones. The horrifying reality locked its jaws around his throat. He loved a captive. He loved a weapon. And if her heart stopped beating, he would drown the entire continent in blood. Midnight cast long, sterile shadows across the underground medical wing. The sharp stench of bleach failed to mask the copper scent of spilled blood staining Ronan's unwashed hands. He sat perfectly rigid in a plastic chair beside the steel surgical bed. Tactical plating still strapped to his chest, he stared at her pale face, listening to the rhythmic, mechanical chirp of the heart monitor. He refused to blink. He refused to leave the room. A soft, hitched breath scraped past her lips. Her dark eyelashes fluttered against bruised skin. "You're awake," Ronan rasped, the words catching on the raw edge of his throat. He leaned forward, bracing his elbows against his knees. She rolled her head against the thin pillow. Pain medication glazed her brown eyes, but they immediately locked onto his face, reading the absolute devastation carved into his features. "Why?" he asked, dropping his voice to a hollow whisper. "Why step in front of the bullet? I branded you. I chained you. I am the nightmare, keeping you in the dark." The jagged burn on her neck flushed against the white bandages. Slowly, fighting the IV lines taped to her wrist, she reached across the gap. Her bruised fingertips brushed the dried blood coating his knuckles. "You aren't a monster," she breathed. Her voice lacked volume but carried absolute certainty. "You just wear a ruthless mask." His final, brittle defense snapped. Bowing his head, he pressed his forehead against the cold metal rail of the mattress. The most lethal warlord on the Eastern Front shook, completely undone by the touch of a wounded girl. "I am terrified," he confessed into the quiet room. "My father ruled this empire with a torturer's blade. He drank the screams of the lower castes. I butchered him to stop the rot. But I swore I would never let anyone close. Terrified, his sick, twisted blood lived inside my own veins. I thought I would ruin anything I touched." Lifting his head, he forced himself to meet her gaze. "But today, when you hit the stones, I realize the only thing I fear is a world where you don't exist." She didn't retreat. Dragging her palm upward, she cupped his rough, stubbled jaw. Her thumb tracked over a smear of dirt on his cheekbone. An electric, suffocating heat filled the sterile bay. A low, rumbling purr vibrated against his ribs, a purely instinctual response to his mate's comfort. Moving with agonizing care, he leaned over the bed rails. He hovered an inch above her mouth, offering her the space to turn away. She tilted her chin upward, bridging the final gap. The kiss carried no violence. It was a desperate, quiet surrender. He tasted sterile saline, the bitter tang of adrenaline, and the intoxicating shock of summer lightning. She twisted her fingers into his dark hair, pulling him closer, with a fierce, surprising hunger that defied her injuries. Resting his forehead against hers, he dragged oxygen into his lungs. He had found his anchor, but a cold, crawling dread slithered down his spine. Her brother still held the comlink. The sniper had vanished into the city. They were locked in a beautiful, fragile glass box, and the hammer was already swinging toward the glass. The sterile stench of the medical wing finally gave way to the sharp, metallic tang of iron gall ink inside the high tower. Ronan braced his shoulders against the arched doorway, tracking the royal artisan's needle. Refusing to let her wear a conqueror's brand for a second longer, he had summoned the Citadel's best inkmaster to bury the burn. The jagged, blistering scar vanished. In its place, a silver wolf tangled in mountain briar wrapped around her pale throat. The artisan wiped the excess ink away with a sterile cloth, bowed low to the floorboards, and silently backed out of the room. The oak door clicked shut. A suffocating, fragile quiet settled over the stone chamber. Ronan stared at the fresh lines on her skin, a phantom ache throbbing in his own forearm. When he was 8 years old, his father had snapped his ulna during a sparring drill. The warlord then dragged him to a bone setter, forcing the boy to endure the agonizing crack of resetting the fracture without medicine. The lesson burned itself into his marrow. Fixing something deeply broken required one final, brutal sting of pain. His boots scuffed the hardwood as he crossed the distance to her velvet chair. She turned slowly, facing the tall, gold-rimmed mirror. Wide brown eyes tracked the reflection. Her trembling fingers reached up, hovering just a millimeter over the raised, swollen ink. The ambient scent in the room fractured. The bitter static of her constant terror evaporated, replaced by the sudden, overwhelming fragrance of warm rain blooming over dry earth. She didn't smell like a prisoner. "You are no longer property of the Blood Moon, nor a slave to my pack," Ronan rasped. The words felt thick, like swallowing crushed gravel. "You are free." She didn't speak. She merely lifted her chin, locking eyes with his reflection in the glass. A single, silent tear spilled over her lower lash line, cutting a clean path down her bruised cheek. The sight of that tear drove a spike of fierce, protective agony straight through his sternum. He faced entire armies without blinking, yet the terrifying reality paralyzed him. This fragile woman held absolute control over his beating heart. "I don't want to be free of you," she whispered. The axis of his world snapped into place. His knees hit the hardwood. The most lethal killer on the Eastern Front dropped to the floor like a devoted knight, wrapping his calloused hands gently around her waist. He buried his face against the silk fabric covering her stomach, dragging oxygen into his lungs. She tangled her fingers into his dark hair. Leaning forward, she rested her cheek against the crown of his head. The raw, unprotected intimacy vibrated through his ribs, drawing a deep, rumbling purr from his throat. "You are my equal," Ronan swore, the vow muffled against her dress. "You are my sovereign." For the first time in a decade, the suffocating guilt of his past lifted. Then, a concussive blast rattled the reinforced glass. The Citadel's emergency war horn blared a deep, earth-shaking warning across the valley. The fragile peace shattered into dust. The enemy had returned to burn their sanctuary to the ground. Sirens shredded the quiet of the tower, chasing Ronan all the way down the spiraling stone stairs to the subterranean levels. He burst through the steel doors of the command center. Chaos reigned. Red strobe lights washed over shouting generals and frantic technicians. Refusing to believe an outer breach was possible, Ronan slammed his bare knuckles against the rim of the central holographic table. Metal shrieked beneath his grip. "Report!" he barked, pitching his voice to cut through the panic. A sweating communications officer scrambled to the opposite side of the table. "Alpha, the perimeter grid flatlined. Anti-air flak cannons are dead. The kinetic shields are completely offline." The floorboards seemed to vanish beneath Ronan's boots. Nothing breached a military-grade energy shield from the outside. He had fortified the walls. He had upgraded the generators himself. "Show me the breach," Ronan demanded, a lethal, predatory focus narrowing his vision. "There is no breach, sir," the tech stammered, his fingers flying across a glass console. Lines of frantic code bled across the primary screen. The generators weren't destroyed. They received a manual shutdown command from inside the network. "We traced the origin to the two-way encrypted radio." Bile rose in the back of Ronan's throat. The device her brother smuggled to her wasn't a radio. It was a digital Trojan horse. Her brother hadn't begged for the security frequencies to launch a rescue mission. He only needed her to establish a direct connection to the Citadel's mainframe. The second she opened the link to hear his voice, she unknowingly deployed a crippling virus straight into the defense grid. Her own blood had sold them to the Zealots. Why? What price could the enemy possibly pay to buy a sister's life? Before he could demand a trace on the boy's location, the radar map erupted in a swarm of crimson dots. "Atmospheric entry," the tech whispered, all color draining from his face. "Dropships." They bypassed the valley. A deafening, structural groan bowed the ceiling plates directly above their heads. Plaster rained down, dusting the holographic map. The enemy didn't march on the gates. They landed directly on the roof. The violent truth locked its jaws around his throat. They weren't here to conquer a city. They were here to steal a god. Turning his back on the monitors, Ronan crossed the room and ripped a titanium broadaxe from the weapons rack. He kicked the command doors open, his combat boots crushing the fallen plaster. He was going to teach the invaders exactly why the continent called him the tyrant. Copper blood slicked the pristine white marble of the upper residential wing. Ronan moved like a threshing machine. Swinging the broad axe in a devastating arc, he cleaved through the chest plates of two heavily armored zealots before their fingers could even twitch toward their triggers. Brutal, calculated carnage followed. He shattered femurs. He tore through Kevlar. He left a trail of ruined corpses leaking into the grout, completely ignoring the tactical defense of the stronghold to carve a straight path toward the west corridor. The bitter, sharp scent of her terror hit his nose, spiking his adrenaline to a lethal high. "Maya!" he roared. Skidding around the final corner, his boots lost traction on the bloody tiles. He caught his balance, taking in the nightmare at the end of the hall. She pressed her spine flat against the dead-end wall, boxed in by 3 zealot shock troopers. Standing safely behind the armored wall of muscle, her brother gripped the activation cylinder of a glowing tungsten EMP net. Trusting the boy had dragged the devil directly to her bedroom door. Ronan lunged, but the boy triggered the cylinder. Crackling electric mesh expanded through the air, wrapping tightly around her torso. High-voltage current snapped. She ripped an agonizing, raw scream from her throat, her knees buckling as the electricity forced her to the floor. The sound of her agony sheared Ronan's soul entirely out of his body. A terrifying, absolute silence swallowed the hallway. It was the icy, breathless vacuum that exists a fraction of a second before a thermobaric explosion. Ronan hurled his axe. The spinning titanium buried itself directly into the sternum of the central trooper. Closing the remaining distance, Ronan abandoned his weapons. He hit the remaining soldiers like a freight train. He snapped a neck with his bare hands. He crushed a windpipe under his boot. He waded through the violence, entirely untouchable, until he stood face to face with the boy. He raised his blood-soaked fist to cave the traitor's skull in. A sharp, metallic clack sounded an inch from his left eardrum. The cold steel of a rifle barrel pressed firmly against his temple, but that wasn't what paralyzed his muscles. It was the hollow, utterly broken look in Maya's eyes as she watched him from the floor, tangled in the sparking net. "Stand down, tyrant!" a gravelly voice ordered from his blind spot. Gunmetal cracked against his temple before he could draw a breath. The marble hallway flipped sideways. He crashed onto the floor tiles, the impact jarring his teeth. Ringing static deafened his ears. He tasted dust and his own blood, waiting for his limbs to obey the frantic commands of his brain. Nothing worked. Combat boots scuffed the marble. Strong hands hauled her upward. She kicked, thrashing against the mesh, but the scent of her sweet rain slowly faded down the corridor toward the waiting ships. Ronan clawed at the grout, his vision bleeding into dark, fuzzy static. A single drop of blood tracked through the dirt on his cheek as the cold dark dragged him under. Oxygen scraped down his throat in a violent, hacking gasp. Ronan planted his steel-plated boots against the grout and shoved a slab of cracked marble off his sternum. The stone crashed against the ruined floorboards. Plaster dust plumed into the air, coating the back of his throat like dry chalk. A lesser wolf would have died from the rifle strike. Surviving the blunt trauma merely ignited a lethal, unpredictable fury in his gut. Dragging himself onto his hands and knees, he waited for the violent spinning in his skull to stop. Copper blood dripped from his temple. The red droplets splattered against the white tiles, counting out the frantic rhythm of his pulse. The crushing vacuum of the empty corridor struck him before his eyes even adjusted to the dark. When he was 14, a feral grizzly had ripped through his canvas tent and dragged away his loyal hunting hound. He tracked the predator for 3 days through the snow with a rusted pocket knife to exact his vengeance. The hole torn into his chest today felt infinitely worse. A vibrating, guttural snarl ripped out of his throat, shaking the loose plaster from the walls. He forced his battered joints to lock, rising to his full height. He scanned the wreckage. Plastic shards from her crushed radio littered the floor beside a smeared puddle of her blood. The zealots had breached his absolute sanctuary and dragged his mate into the night. Stepping toward the blood, his boot crunched over a pile of shimmering silver powder left by the sparking net. The Council of the Blood Moon hoarded that specific, military-grade silver. Her brother had not acted alone. The corrupt elders were pulling the strings from the shadows. Dropping back to the tiles, Ronan pressed his bare fingers into the wet crimson. The lingering scent of sweet rain and pure terror coated his lungs. He wiped her blood across his chestplate, a terrifying oath of absolute ruin. Retrieving a discarded titanium broadsword from a dead sentry, he turned his back on the empty hall. He was going to paint the northern peaks with their blood, and he would butcher any man who stood in his way. Stalking past the ruined inner gates, Ronan ignored the frantic shouting of his surviving soldiers and kicked open the doors to the subterranean war room. Blaring sirens bled through the shattered glass windows, but the noise failed to penetrate his lethal focus. He braced his hands against the tactical table. Titanium groaned and bent beneath his bleeding knuckles. They dragged her to the snowy peaks, Ronan rasped, his voice vibrating with absolute murder. The ruined zealot temple, the silver brand marking her throat, tethered her soul directly to his spine. A sharp, undeniable hook pulled his internal compass straight toward the northern mountains. General Vane slammed a gauntleted fist onto the table. "Alpha, you cannot breach that ridge. It is an obvious trap," the scarred veteran barked, his face flushing dark red. "They want you to chase. You are walking into a meat grinder. We must fortify the perimeter." Ronan vaulted the bent table, moving faster than human eyesight could track. He clamped his fingers around Vane's throat, lifting the veteran entirely off the floorboards with a single arm. "I do not want a siege," Ronan whispered, the quiet tone far more terrifying than a roar. "I want a slaughter." He tossed Vane backward. Armor crashed against the concrete, leaving a deafening ring echoing off the vaulted ceiling. The surrounding officers scrambled backward, swallowing their objections. Ronan turned to leave, but a phantom blade drove itself straight up under his ribs. He hitched a frantic breath, his boots stumbling against the concrete as he clamped a hand over his chest plate. Blinding, sickening agony radiated through the tether. It wasn't his pain. The zealots had ignited the torture. A rusted knife twisted in his own lungs with every second she screamed across the distance. His inner beast did not whimper. It ripped a violent, bloodthirsty snarl through his mind, demanding absolute carnage. Refusing to let her bleed alone for another heartbeat, Ronan marched out of the bunker and stepped into the freezing mountain storm. He was walking directly into an open grave, intending to drag the entire world down with him. Frozen wind sliced across his cheeks for 3 agonizing miles. By the time Ronan crested the hidden valley ridge, his tactical boots squelched with a mixture of packed snow and fresh blood. Carving a brutal path through 3 outer patrols had left his armor painted in crimson. He stopped at the edge of the jagged cliff, staring down at the dark stone temple dominating the basin. Floodlights illuminated the courtyard. Hundreds of armed shock troopers patrolled the perimeter beneath the scopes of perched snipers and mounted artillery. The odds promised certain death. He stepped off the ledge anyway. He had spent his entire adult life building iron cages to contain the ruthless violence of his bloodline, terrified of becoming his father. Tonight, that monster finally had a purpose. He drew his titanium broadsword from his spine. Sharp metal hissed against the leather scabbard, cutting through the howl of the wind. The memory of executing his tyrannical father flashed behind his eyelids, the sickening snap of cervical vertebrae, followed by the terrifying, hollow quiet of an empty throne. He had sworn to never let that dead, icy calm consume him again. He welcomed the frostbite now. A raw, tearing scream echoed from the bowels of the temple. The horrible sound bounced off the icy cliffs, carrying her specific, desperate cadence. Then, the echo died. The wind settled. A suffocating wave of absolute surrender washed over him through the tether. He could physically feel the cold silver cuffs biting into her wrists, leeching the fight from her muscles. Her brilliant, defiant spark was drowning in the dark. The zealots weren't trying to execute her. They were trying to break her mortal vessel, to harvest the god locked inside. Standing alone against a fortified army, the cold truth paralyzed his lungs. He might actually fail. He might reach the altar a second too late. His inner beast rejected the logic, roaring in complete, violent defiance. He refused to bow. He refused to break. He would not let her bleed out on a cold stone altar alone. Ambient heat radiated from his armor, literally melting the packed snow beneath his boots as his core temperature spiked. The tyrant closed his eyes, severed his ties to his own humanity, and charged directly into the firing line. The brutal trek through the mountain blizzard ended at the oak doors of the sanctuary. Splintered wood erupted inward, spraying jagged shrapnel across the stone vestibule. Ronan breached the threshold like a living battering ram. Titanium hissed through the freezing draft, severing the front line of zealot defenders before they could even unholster their sidearms. He refused to break stride. His combat boots crushed sternums and shattered shields, leaving a wake of ruined corpses. The corridor choked on the stench of sulfur, pitch torches, and spilled copper. In the northern trenches, he once watched a feral wolf chew through its own trapped leg to survive the winter. Tonight, Ronan possessed that exact, rabid desperation. Kicking the iron grate off its hinges, he spilled into the central nave. The chaotic din of the slaughter behind him vanished into the vaulted ceiling. Suspended above a blood-stained granite altar, Maya hung from glowing silver chains. Matted dark hair obscured her face. The metal bit deep into her wrists. Pure, sickening panic twisted his intestines into tight knots. "Maya," Ronan roared. The single word rattled the stained glass windows. She remained entirely motionless. Beside the high priest, her brother trembled, his knuckles white around a ceremonial dagger. What price the zealots paid to buy a brother's treason no longer mattered. Ronan abandoned his tactical defense, dropping his titanium shield to the tiles to reach her faster. Gunpowder cracked from the shadowed balcony. 3 high-caliber rounds drove directly into his chestplate. Kinetic force stole the oxygen from his lungs. The impact mirrored a head-on collision with a freight train, halting his forward momentum instantly. A wet, ragged gasp scraped up his throat. Black spots swarmed his peripheral vision as he looked down at the blood pouring over his armor. Titanium slipped from his numb fingers, clanging against the tiles. His ruined knees finally buckled, driving him hard into the stone at the base of her altar. The unforgiving granite of the altar steps bit into his kneecaps. Ronan gagged on a mouthful of hot blood, spitting the dark crimson fluid onto the white grout. Dragging a single breath into his ruined lungs tasted exactly like inhaling crushed glass. Refusing to surrender to the encroaching dark, he locked his spine and dragged his chin upward. He fixed his stare entirely on the woman suspended in the chains. "Drag him outside and burn the corpse!" the high priest shrieked, aiming a crooked finger at the altar steps. The command bounced off the vaulted ceiling, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. Then, the scrape of a jagged inhale broke the quiet. Maya lifted her head. Purple bruises marred her cheekbones, yet the second her brown eyes found his kneeling form, her spine snapped rigid. The mystical tether between their souls throbbed, flooding Ronan's chest with a shockwave of her suffocating grief. She felt his pulse failing. Dragging the corners of his mouth upward, Ronan offered a bloody smile. He offered a silent vow of devotion as the cold closed in. "Ronan," she whispered. The syllables barely disturbed the dust motes, yet the ambient air pressure inside the sanctuary violently warped. Rejecting the pain of the silver, she locked her shoulders. "No," she rasped. The silver links binding her wrists started to smoke. Dull metal superheated, shifting rapidly from gray to a blistering red. The high priest scrambled backward, tripping over his own ceremonial robes. "The ritual is incomplete. Bind her now!" A low, seismic vibration rattled the floorboards beneath Ronan's bleeding knees. He stared upward as the warm brown irises he loved burned away. Twin suns of blinding energy ignited in her skull. The mortal girl vanished, and a terrifying ancient deity finally answered his dying prayer. The blistering heat of the silver chains vanished, replaced instantly by a violent plummet in temperature. Frost crept across the granite altar. Ronan shivered, his blood congealing over his shattered ribs, while the overwhelming stench of ozone and raw lightning choked the oxygen from the room. The crushing pressure of her aura drove the zealot guards to the tiles. Rifles clattered against the stone as trained killers clamped their hands over their bleeding eardrums. "Shoot the monster!" the priest shrieked, dragging his body behind a marble pillar. Not a single soldier possessed the strength to lift a trigger finger. The superheated silver chains simply detonated. Metal vaporized into a cloud of sparkling, white-hot ash. Maya dropped to the frost-covered tiles, landing on her bare feet without a whisper of sound. Bedtime lore spoke of the first Lycan king swallowing a fallen star to burn away his mortal frailties. Ronan finally comprehended the myth, bleeding out on the floor while staring directly at a walking supernova. The ragged slave dress dissolved into weaving, ethereal shadows. Blinding moonlight wrapped around her collarbones. A spectral, towering projection of a white wolf superimposed itself over her human frame, bearing translucent fangs at the cowering army. "You brought violence into my sanctuary," Maya echoed. The dialogue carried the terrifying, overlapping cadence of 1,000 ancient queens speaking in perfect unison. Drawing a concealed dagger from his robes, the priest lunged blindly from the shadows behind her. "Maya!" Ronan choked, coughing a fresh wave of crimson onto his chin. She didn't even turn around. Flicking her wrist, she unleashed a shockwave of raw kinetic force. The impact struck the priest like a cannonball, launching him backward through the frozen air. Bones snapped as he collided with the stone wall, sliding down to the tiles in an unconscious heap. Total rout. The remaining shock troopers abandoned their weapons, sprinting toward the splintered oak doors in blind terror. As their screaming faded into the blizzard outside, the spectral wolf dissolved. Blinding energy receded from her pupils, leaving the frantic, terrified brown eyes of his mate. The deity retreated, leaving a desperate woman sprinting across the frost to stop his heart from taking its final beat. The terrifying aura of the deity faded, leaving Maya to collapse onto the frosted tiles beside his shattered chest. Her freezing palms pressed into the cracked titanium, tears mixed with the blood coating his breastplate. The sharp stench of ozone evaporated, replaced by the comforting scent of burning pine and warm earth. White energy seeped from her fingertips. The magic sank past his ruined armor, knitting his splintered ribs back together. Ronan dragged a violent gasp into his lungs. He tasted clean oxygen instead of rusted copper. Waiting for the ringing in his eardrums to fade, he focused entirely on her face. He lifted a calloused hand. His thumb dragged through the grime, marking her bruised cheek. A ragged sob echoed off the granite altar. Ronan shifted his weight against the stone. Freshly knitted muscle pulled tight across his chest as he tracked the sound. Her brother knelt in the frost, burying his face in dirt-caked fingers. "Why?" Ronan rasps, pitching his voice into a vibrating threat. "Why sell her to the zealots?" The boy jerked his chin upward, exposing wide, horrified eyes. "The priest promised a cure," the boy choked out. "He promised to extract the deity so she could live a normal life. I just wanted my sister safe." They lied. The rigid tension in Ronan's shoulders bled out. Foolish devotion drove the betrayal, not greed. Maya refused to scream at her betrayer. She rose from the floorboards, her posture carrying the undeniable weight of a sovereign ruler. "Go," she ordered, the single syllable cutting through the freezing draft. "Leave this territory. Never return." Scrambling backward over the tiles, the boy turned and sprinted blindly into the mountain blizzard. The sanctuary fell dead quiet, leaving Ronan staring at the woman who just resurrected him. They survived the slaughter, but the true war for the continent was just beginning. Sunlight sliced through the reinforced glass of the medical wing, banishing the nightmares of the temple ruins 30 miles behind them. The sterile scent of iodine replaced the metallic tang of battle. Ronan pushed himself up from the steel mattress. His skin stretched over healed tissue, completely unmarred by the sniper rounds. Her divine energy thrummed a steady rhythm beneath his pulse, settling his inner beast into a quiet, lethal calm. He bypassed his ruined tactical armor. Pulling a gray tunic over his broad shoulders, he let the rough fabric ground him in the present reality. Striding out of the ward, he navigated the spiraling stone corridors until he breached the central command hub. Surviving officers snapped to rigid attention. Boots clicked sharply against the concrete floor. "Open a global broadcast," Ronan ordered, commanding absolute obedience. Every pack, every territory. The primary monitor flashed a green confirmation. Ronan locked his golden eyes directly onto the camera lens. "The war is over," he stated. The blunt words dropped like stones into a quiet pond. "The old laws burn today." He planted his knuckles against the metal console. "I order the immediate destruction of every slave pit on this continent," he continued, a lethal promise vibrating in his sternum. Release your marked captives before sundown, or you answer to my blade." He cut the feed. The screen went black. The surrounding generals stopped breathing entirely. Turning his back on the monitors, Ronan listened to the low hum of the server towers, filling the terrified silence of the room. He had just fractured the foundation of their entire world, and he knew perfectly well the surviving warlords would send their assassins before midnight. 3 months later, the bitter mountain frost surrendered to the brutal thaw of spring. Ronan braced his forearms against the iron railing of the high balcony, tracking the movement in the valley below. The sharp smell of diesel exhaust mixed with blooming pine. A convoy of armored transports rumbled through the outer gates. They didn't carry conquered prisoners. They hauled thousands of emancipated refugees, seeking asylum within his borders. Bare footsteps padded across the hardwood behind him. He didn't need to turn around. The crisp scent of rainwater announced her presence. Thin arms wrapped around his torso. She pressed her cheek directly against his spine. His inner beast purred a rumbling vibration, echoing deep inside his ribs. He turned, framing her jaw with calloused fingers. The jagged slave brand no longer marred her throat. The silver ink of his pack crest gleamed against her pale skin. He dragged his thumb across the raised lines. "We did it," she whispered. A genuine smile touched the corners of her mouth. "No," Ronan corrected, lowering his head until his breath brushed her lips. "You saved us all." She tilted her chin upward. The kiss offered no violence, only a consuming heat. He tasted the salt of the mountain wind and the lingering spark of her ancient magic. Pulling back slightly, he rested his forehead against hers. They had broken the iron chains of the old world. But as he stared into her calculating brown eyes, he realized the goddess was still wide awake beneath the surface, waiting patiently for her next conquest.